Mr. Rock, welcome to A Bit of Orange. What can we do for you? I'm going to start with my definition because, again, most of the definitions you get... Actually, hold on, I'm going to poke right here.
Sorry, I was going to say...
Behold, bask in its glory. Are you seeing that?
Yeah, I'm seeing it. Sorry, there was
All right.
a small thing telling me to pinch something to increase, but I had to wait for that to go.
All right, so let me walk you through this because, again, this is not the definition I have come up with because I am a creationist. If I were an atheist or an agnostic and an evolutionist, I would absolutely accept this definition because I think it makes the most sense and really tells, it specifies what Darwinian evolution is as distinct from what it is not. So let me walk you through it and we'll see if you can find any problems. Evolution is an unguided natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes which did not previously exist. These new genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior, both of which increase the organism's ability to survive and pass on these traits to offspring. Ah, isn't that lovely? Like a breath of fresh air, like a spring breeze, like the summer rains. But let's go through it a step at a time so I can explain it. So, first of all, evolution is an unguided natural process. This is the place where I have to separate what evolution is from what... There are people called old earth creationists or evolutionary creationists who go, well, evolution happened, but God directed it. And so it's kind of like a natural series of miracles. And I go, oh, you don't know what natural or miracles are. So that doesn't make any sense. Evolution is meant to be what nature left to nature does. So like erosion. Erosion is not the kind of things where, people come along and alter the rock according to its physical properties, so we have the face of different presidents popping out. Erosion is just what happens to rocks when left outside, right? Those are two very different things. The poodle, like I said before, does not happen in nature because it would not survive. The poodle is what we do when we choose certain features, certain genetic traits, and we eventually whittle down the number of genes that a dog has, so we get something that looks like a cotton ball with an attitude. Apparently that's something people want. So again, evolution is meant to be an unguided natural process. And I have to distinguish this because a lot of times people will go, well, scientists in the lab have been able to blah, blah, blah. And I go, okay, that's great. That tells us about microbiology. It tells us about genetics. It tells us about what intelligent design can do. But what the scientist does in the lab does not prove what nature left to nature will do or what it has done. And that's an important distinction, because I could point to these rocks and go, well, look, erosion, given enough time and the right probability, would create George Washington. No, it wouldn't. So to distinguish here, the picture on the right, the black and white picture, is what Mount Rushmore looked like before we touched it. That is what erosion does. When nature is left to nature, that's what happens. So what happened when we got to it is artificial changes. Artificial is the term that we use when people are involved, like artificial selection as opposed to natural selection. And that bothers me, because I'm like, artificial selection should be when robots are doing it, right? I don't know. Maybe that's just me. I don't watch Star Trek.
That makes sense when I think about it.
Right. If you had a farm run by robots and they were choosing what kind of chickens to breed, that would be artificial selection. That's what and I would love to watch a robot run farm. I'd pay money to see that. Anyway, so step number one is that it's an unguided natural process. Now, again, we need to distinguish what parts of the process we're talking about. Because again, I could point to that tree and say that tree had no human intervention. It was just nature left to nature, growing by itself. And that was happening in the time period where this change happened. So obviously, the change from the black and white picture to the color picture on the left is just a natural change. And like, this is the kind of argument you get sometimes. You have to say, no, no, no. What you're pointing at with the arrow is nature left to nature. It's a tree growing. Like, nobody added branches to that artistically to create that tree. It was just growing. But the changes that happened at the same time are a different kind of change. You can't point to one change that's happening in a time period and go, therefore, everything else that happened at the same time is the same kind of change. So we have to distinguish between what different changes are happening simultaneously. So similarly, you could point to, say, some time frame in evolutionary history and say, well, at this point, a whole bunch, let's say the dodos went extinct. The dodos all died out. That was a change, a drastic change in allele frequency. The dodos are all dead. I'm like, okay, that is a change, but that's not an evolutionary change, because that won't turn fish into lizards or lizards into mammals. So while it did happen on the timeline, it's not the kind of change that we're looking for. So we have to distinguish between what different mechanisms do and what they don't do. Following along so far?
Yeah, I'm following along so far.
Excellent. Just want to make sure. All right. So in terms of your timeline, you've got a couple of different things that can happen. So we start off with our population of worms. So worms can make the same worms. Worms can make different worms. Worms can all die, or worms can eventually produce something that's not a worm. So again, if you're looking at different biological changes, genetic changes, they're taken to some kind of, future point, some kind of extreme over however many successive generations, they're going to wind up at one of these. Either a long time from now, the worm will lead to just more worms that are the exact same, or like we've done with dogs, we have dogs that are still dogs, but they're different dogs, such that instead of being a wolf, we have the poodle, which is a result of particular genetic changes. But it's not the kind of genetic change that will make them fly or give them sonar. So we have to look at what kind of change there is. So this is just the worm population has a certain number of genes that make worm parts and worm features, different alleles. You can shuffle those and shuffle those and shuffle those and sometimes lose them and get a lot of different phenotypes. And that's what we've done with dogs, with chickens, with the cabbage plant. We've taken the existing genes and shuffled them, sometimes lost them, and it creates a wide variety of phenotypes, but that doesn't create the genes that didn't already exist in the population. So that when you shuffle the worm genes, it doesn't create fish genes, it just shuffles the worm genes that were already there. Now you can lose worm genes, and if you lose enough, eventually the population goes extinct because it takes a certain number of genes to make a functioning organism. And if you lose too many of those, it can't survive, and then they die. And if that becomes the norm, the population goes away. So in order to go from worm to fish, we have to somehow gain the genetic information that it takes to add fish parts that a worm doesn't have, that a fish does have, that distinguishes those two. Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So this is where the genetic component comes in, that we have to think about. Genes are the piece of DNA that codes for particular structures, functions, and behaviors. And if we're talking about one kind of thing changing into another kind of thing, we have to acknowledge that there are genes that a worm has, and there are genes that a fish have, and those genes code for their structures, functions, and behaviors. And if we're going to go from worm to fish, then whatever distinguishes fish from worm has to be added to the worm population over however long you want to take it, But if you don't add those fish genes to the worm population, all you have is just more worms. Now, does that all make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
I do have the question of, is there any chance for anything in between the fish and the worm to exist between whatever amount of time that there is? Like, let's say, for the sake of argument, we come up with, I know this probably doesn't exist, but at least I hope not. We come up with like an erm or something like that. It's a worm with like weird, like tiny fins or something like that.
Oh, it would be a wish. A wish is a fish. A wish is a worm with fish parts. It's a Disney song in there somewhere.
Is it really?
No, but it should
Oh,
be.
there is. Yeah.
A wish is a worm with fish parts evolving into a fish. It was the original Snow White, but it didn't go over well with test audiences. It changed into something about a dream your heart makes or whatever. I don't know. It used to be more scientific and dwarves and apples and I don't know. Anyway, so if this story was true, if that's the story that's happening, that somewhere there would have to be. I mean, not only there wouldn't only be one transitional form. There would be a whole lot of transitional forms. As you know, there's a lot of different parts between worm and fish. So you're not looking for just that one step that's like halfway between, but there's also got to be the step between halfway between and where you started from. So for every step up the evolutionary tree, there should be a lot of different varieties, like any animation sequence, essentially. Things that are, a little this, a little that. And again, the fossil record is supposed to be where we find those. And we don't. And we should find just billions of them for every part of the evolutionary story. There should be just a constant series of things transitioning from one kind of distinct, clear kind into another, whether as far as from worm into fish or from, I guess, lizard into turtle and snake. But like in the fossil record, we find bats. We don't find a partial bat or a half bat or like a quarter bat. Whatever transition had to go through there, it didn't leave any record if it happened, which is one of the arguments against it, is that, well, if it's taking millions of years and fossils happen periodically, there should be something in there. And because this kind of transition has to happen for every step up the evolutionary ladder, that collection of intermediate steps should be for every place on the tree. Every branch that branches should have a collection of intermediate steps. And we really don't find any at all. There's a handful of things people will argue for, but inevitably, if you look into it, you realize that it fails. But if you look at it with evolutionary lenses, to a child with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Anyway, did that answer your question?
Yeah, that answered my question.
Okay. So let me continue along the genetic path here. So evolution is an unguided natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes which did not previously exist. Now, this is where I have to throw in a bunch of amendments because otherwise people start typing in all caps in the comment section. I am not saying that for every step up the evolutionary ladder from worm to fish, fish to lizard, that the next thing has more DNA nucleotides or more total chromosomes or more total genes. All I'm saying is that a worm does not have the genes it takes to make fish parts. So the cartoon worm I'm working with, I drew eyes on him because it makes him cute, but we would assume that the first worm didn't have eyes. But eventually fish do have eyes and fins and scales and a skeleton and all these different parts. So in order to go from worm to fish, there has to be the gain of whatever genes it takes to make eyes, to make fins, to make gills, to make a swim bladder, all the things that make fish, fish, because worms don't already have those genes. So this is just kind of a common sense approach to, well, if a fish has these structures, whatever few structures you need to say that this is distinctly fish as opposed to worm, the worm doesn't have the genes for those. That's why the worm is a worm and not a fish. So again, not super controversial. It's just if you want to change worm population into fish, you have to add whatever genes are necessary so that it has these structures, functions, and behaviors that distinguish fish from worm. Now again, I will pause for questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I do know that there are certain families of worms that do already live in the water and have some of the parts that are needed to make a fish. What would you say for those?
Well, I mean, the premise is the same. The point is not to say that I have decided that worms can't survive in water. I mean, on the evolutionary story, the earliest worms would have survived in water, but the earliest ones wouldn't have had gills. Gills are a fairly complicated structure, and so the earliest multicellular worms would have been just doing gas exchange through whatever skin layer they had, if they had a skin layer. I don't know what the first worms look like, nobody does, but assuming they're just fairly simple flatworm kind of things, they wouldn't have a gas exchange structure. They would just have gas exchange, just like frogs can do gas exchange through their skin because they have very thin skin with blood vessels near the surface. And if you watched Frozen 2, you know that turtles can breathe through their butts, which means that they also can do gas exchange through the thin epidermal layers in around their butt, which is a weird place to put it, but hey, I didn't design the turtle. But so gas exchange can be done through the skin. Insects also don't have gills or lungs. They do gas exchange primarily just through openings in their exoskeleton. And so that's what the earliest worm would have. And so even if there's that intermediate step where, worms develop gills and then develop fins so that they can turn into fish, there has to be the increase in genetic information that the first worms didn't have, that next stage of worm did have, so that they can have gills. Because again, either the first generation of worm had the genes to make all of those fish parts, or they didn't. And I would find it absurd to think that the first generation of worms would have all of the genes that would ever come after. So you have to assume that the earliest worm was very simple, something multicellular, but something very simple. And as different structures evolved, the genes that create those structures, functions, and behaviors have to come into being so that genetically it can cause, the genotype can cause the phenotype. So, because the information has to come first, and then it creates the structures and functions that follow. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Awesome.
Thank you for clearing that one up.
I'm here to help. All right, so that's all I mean here is essentially when you go from any particular place on the evolutionary story up to the next branch, or however you want to phrase it, the next stage will have structures, functions, and behaviors that the previous one didn't have, and so the genes that code for that have to be added to the population in order for that change to happen. I have exchanged emails with an evolutionist so stubborn as to, he actually told me that no, fish do have the genes for legs and lungs. They just were modified when they became lizards. I'm like, okay, if you're so dedicated to the evolutionary theory that you've decided, yes, fish had the genes for legs and lungs all the time, those didn't have to be added for fish to turn into lizards, I can't help you at that point, because I'm like, basically you have to just go, bacteria had all the genes that would ever exist, and they just decided to express them slowly. Like, let's just try out the worm genes. We'll keep all the rest for later, like they're just doing beta testing. I'm like, no, you have to add genes that weren't there before. That's the only way this story makes any sense.
I mean, the definition that most people who go with the evolution theory even say to themselves, it's the adding of the genes themselves. So it makes no sense to say they're already there. Then no evolution by your definition would be happening.
Yeah, ultimately what I find is that if people feel like they're having an argument, logic kind of goes out the window. They get into debate mode, and it's just, I'm going to prove you wrong no matter how ridiculous I have to be. And at that point, I'm like, oh, I feel like the conversation's over then.
Oh, yeah, I get that.
All I can do is try not to be that person myself. So let's all try to be better, Internet. All right. So here's just the evolutionary tree to kind of point out what I'm saying. The bacteria that first evolved, however they got there, did not have the genes it took to make worms or fish or lizards or anything else. They became worms eventually, so they gained the genes it takes to distinguish worm from bacteria, which is quite an enormous leap, but we don't have time for that right now. But so the worms that evolved did not have the genes it takes to make a fish or a lizard or a squirrel or an ape. But eventually they gained the genes to make fish. So every step, again, it's whatever process we're talking about, the genes to make it have to go from not existing to existing. So it's just pretty much that simple there. I'm not evoking or rejecting any mechanisms that would make it happen, just acknowledging that change has to occur if evolution is happening.
Okay.
So what I've done as an example is just make it very, very simple. Is just say, all right, well, let's say you've got a worm and you want to turn it into a fish. Let's say that all you need is gills and fins. And each one is just one gene for each of those. So you just take this worm, you add 2 genes, boom, you got a fish. So again, just for the sake of argument, to make it as simple as possible, I'm like, all right, this is what we're talking about. So when you add those genes, those new genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior. And it's not just a matter of adding the genes to the worm, but they have to be expressed phenotypically as physical parts and the function to use them. So you've got the genes for fish parts added to the worm genome. Structures result from those genes. Control functions in the brain have to also be added to use those features. And then the behavior to use those structures and functions for survival and reproduction have to be included as well. And this is one of those things, this is why I put associated behaviors, because a lot of people tend to not think at all about the software upgrade that comes at every stage. Because if you could somehow genetically alter a fish so that it grew legs and lungs, and then you put it on land, it would die. Because merely having legs does not mean it knows how to walk or how to breathe with lungs. That there is a software upgrade so that its brain now has to be able to use those functions according to their structure, but also has to be able to use them for their own survival. So the way that a fish behaves, you can't just toss it on land and go, all right, act like a fish, you'll be fine. There's a whole new collection of different behaviors that have to be added to survival on land. So merely having the physical parts isn't good enough, because the way a fish uses fins, if it uses legs like fins, it's not going to get anywhere on land. It's going to die. And so this is one of those things where, again, nobody tends to talk about this. We just assume, well, if the fins eventually get strong enough and long enough where it could support the fish's weight on land, then it turns into a lizard. Like, well, there's also the software upgrade so that its brain can adjust the behavior for supporting its weight on land, which fins don't do. Fins don't need to support the weight of the fish. And even if the fins grew and added bones and muscles so they physically could, you also have to add the behavior so that the fish would, or the fish lizard at that point, would use them in that fashion. Because again, if all you do is add the structure, it doesn't use them in a different way, the way the different structure needs to be used, and it's not a benefit to their survival, it becomes a detriment. So not just physical complexity, but associated behavior. So in the last one, we added genes. Now those genes create new physical structures, but also the behavior to use them for survival benefit and reproduction benefit. All that makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Whenever I see people talk about the different, when it comes to the fish to worm category, a lot of people, when this topic specifically comes up, points out stuff like the mudkip and all that. What would your response to that be?
Well,
mudskip, not
something
mudkip.
like the mudskip or anything like that is it's designed to live in its environment and behave the way that it behaves. The mudskipper is not a fish that like somebody threw up on land and it sort of figured it out at the last second. That it's designed to do what a mudskipper does. Other fish can't do that. And so if you already have evolutionary lenses to look through, then you can wedge that into your evolutionary sequence there and say, well, it fits this part. But the problem is you can't just take a fish in one step and then toss it on land and have it survive in that sense. That, again, it's got to have the physical ability to survive hopping around from puddle to puddle that way. And it's got to have the software upgrade in its brain that it would intentionally do that. Because again, mudskippers are kind of designed to have that behavior. It's not something where, a normal fish would behave in that way. And so there's, again, multiple stages that have to go from a normal type of, water-only fish to the kind of fish that can survive for brief hops across land there. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, that's one that I find it's weird when that's brought up and when it comes to conversations like this. So I appreciate you clarifying that one.
Sure. A short version is it's going to depend on the individual you're talking to. Because again, somebody who is only looking through evolutionary lenses will see something like that and go, well, clearly that's an intermediate step between fish and amphibians or something. But I find that's just a result of, number one, having that evolutionary bias, and secondly, oversimplifying it and not considering all the factors that are involved to actually make that leap from can't survive on land at all to designed to actually survive for brief times between puddles and whatnot. Mudskippers are funny little things too. And you find that kind of thing, that those weird adaptations are in all kinds of animal kinds. But in every one, like if you try to wedge it into an evolutionary story and you keep it sort of superficial, it kind of works on the surface. But when you actually look at what are the adaptations, what are the physical structures and behaviors that are necessary, and not like what stages can you go through, but what are the collections of physical properties and the collections of behaviors that have to all be in place at the same time for that creature to survive with those behaviors or in that environment, it becomes increasingly complex. And you realize, all right, this isn't just one accidental step after another, because there's all these things that have to be in place all at the same time. Otherwise, you give the mud skipper the physical ability to do that, but not the brain that knows how to do it for its own survival, then it just dies like any other fish. If you give it just the software, so it's going to want to behave in that manner, but not the physical ability to do so, it dies like any other fish. So you've got to have these multiple things together at the same time before it's of any survival value. And if you don't have them at the same time and it's not a survival value, natural selection selects it out so that it doesn't get there in the first place. So natural selection actually stops evolution from happening. But we will talk about that in the near future, because I do have slides about that coming up.
Got it.
All right. So this is the point where the genes come into actually changing what you see in a population, both in terms of what it looks like and what it can do and how it behaves. So all of those are important. So finally, both of which increase the organism's ability to survive and pass on these traits to offspring. So we have to distinguish between just genetic changes and evolutionary changes. And for something to be an evolutionary change, it has to be the kind of thing that not only helps the individual that has that helpful mutation, but also has to be able to help it to survive and pass it on to offspring. And there's a whole lot of hypotheticals that could be brought in here, but if you could somehow, let's say you could create a turtle that's like 3 times faster than any other turtle. He gets this lucky, super fast turtle mutation. But because of that, either he sticks out amongst the turtles and it's easier for predators to find him, so he doesn't live long enough. You see this blur of turtle and the hawks come and eat him, so he doesn't have any offspring. Or there's something about that behavior that makes him less appealing to the other female turtles. And so again, maybe it helps him to evade predators and he's faster, and so that helps him personally. But if it doesn't help him to also pass it on to the next generation so that it becomes increasingly part of the population, becoming beneficial to all of the offspring that carry it, then it's a lucky mutation. It might be a beneficial mutation, but it won't be an evolutionary change because it won't affect the population going forward into the following generations. So again, that's just sort of by definition what evolution has to tell is not, well, what happens if a worm gets a super gene and it becomes super worm? Well, if he doesn't pass that gene on, then nothing. One worm dons a red cape and a big S on his chest and saves the day, but dies a bachelor and has no kids. He doesn't leave behind the population that turns into fish. He gets a comic book and a movie deal, but that's it. That's the end of the story. And we're talking about how do worms turn into fish? So there has to be not only survivability, so they can live long enough to reproduce, because dead things don't reproduce, but also have to be able to reproduce, because things that don't reproduce also don't reproduce. So I think that's a necessary part of any understanding of evolution. So there is my definition, which I think, again, if I were an evolutionist, I think that I would accept this as saying everything that evolution needs to say in a sort of concise way that takes into account not just the Darwinian tree of life, but also our sort of understanding of how genetics has to play a role in all these different phases. Now, I will pause for station identification. Tell me, do you have any questions, any pushback, any of this seem like it doesn't make sense or fail somehow? Anything at all?
So the only thing that, when you first rolled out the definition, the only thing that I had queries about for a moment there was the fact that you specifically add in the increase in the organism's ability to survival. But we both know what direction we're trying to go with it. So for me to nitpick that would be kind of counterproductive.
Okay.
Everything else seems to make perfect sense. If anything, I have to be honest, that this is me more just trying to figure out, because I listen to a lot of creationists. Obviously, I came from Professor Stick and all that, but I wanted to give people like you a fair shake at the idea of evolution not being. So a lot of this was me just trying to listen to what you had to say, if that makes sense.
Sure. So again, the reason why I came up with this, because people so often define evolution so that they're talking about something that is completely incapable of causing the Darwinian tree of life to grow. They like change over time. I'm like, okay, sure, if fish turn into lizards, that's a change, but what kind of change? Like if you're going to say it's a scientific fact that it's even plausible, well, you have to define it better than just change. Like, turning rocks into airplanes is a change, but if Well, if that's the only definition you get, you're not going to wind up with a blueprint, let alone are you going to fly to Orlando. You need to define your terms. Scientific definitions have to be clear enough to distinguish between what they are and what they're not. And frankly, I've never had an evolutionist actually define evolution so that it means anything evolutionary. I did a debate last year where the evolutionist I was talking to defined it to me. Evolution to him is passing alleles from one generation to the next. And I said, that's just reproduction. Reproduction isn't the same thing as evolution. And again, if we're having a debate, that means you think my position is nothing reproduces, which is not my position. Another one, Vice Rhino, he said that evolution is any change in genetics from one generation to the next. And I said, so the fact that you're not an identical clone to your mother means that you evolved from your mother. And he said, yes. And I said, all right, first of all, I refuse to say I evolved from my mother because that sounds weird. But also, that's not an evolutionary change. Because again, you would have to show that you have some kind of gene for some structure or function or behavior that your mother did not, whereas anything we know about genetics says all you are is just a recombination of the genes that already existed in your parents. That's how sexual reproduction works, is you get some genes from the mother, some from the father. It creates perhaps a combination of alleles that didn't exist before. Like when you take a deck of cards, you shuffle a deck of cards, there's 52 cards in the deck. But you can deal out more than 2.5 million 5-card hands. You can play poker with 2.5 million people and deal them each a different hand with only those 52 cards. Okay, you can shuffle for 1 billion years and never make a new card. And the fact that you can make all these varieties and the fact that you can shuffle forever doesn't tell you where the cards came from. If somebody says, well, where did the Queen of Hearts come from? Well, I can shuffle the deck. Okay, well, you've changed the arrangement of cards. Did that make a new one? No, it's just you've shuffled it. So sexual reproduction is essentially shuffling the genes that already existed in the parent population. But you can do that for 1 billion years and not make a new gene. That's not how genes come into being. And so you can't use that to explain where structures, functions, and behaviors come from. I mean, the best you can do is perhaps show a phenotype that didn't exist because of a combination of genes. Because sometimes when you combine genes that already exist, you wind up with a phenotype that wasn't expressed in that way because the genes that existed weren't combined in that way. But again, it's not a matter of merely creating a new phenotype, because you can't take worm genes and shuffle them until you get fish. Like, it just doesn't work that way. Like, everything we know about genetics shows that there is genetic distinction between the different kinds, and if you're going to go from one to the other, you have to add genes that weren't there. You can't just shuffle the ones that already were.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Would you mind before we go? Yep, no, it's good. Would you mind before we go on to the next one? I actually have. Oh, sorry. It looked like your screen froze for a second. There's 2 bits of I don't know if I necessarily wouldn't call them evidence, but just queries I kind of want to bring up to you just to see what you have to say. So,
sure.
I have seen a study in which there is a human who had grown a small tail.
Oh, sure. I've seen a couple of those.
What would your what would you say on that one? Would you say that would be some form of evolution going on? Would you say that's just freak accident?
If I had to pick a category, it would be freak accident. Ultimately, I mean, there's a handful of those that I've seen. And ultimately, every time that kind of thing is examined, it's not the development of a new structure. It's like, you ever heard of a skin tag?
Yeah.
You know what that is? It's like your skin just decides that it's going to grow an extra chunk of skin. Like, sometimes it's due to irritation. Like, it'll show up around like where your collar rubs on you a lot. That's basically kind of what it is. It's just, there's like an extra bit of skin and the sort of subdermal fat there that just kind of created a string. But that's it. There's no new muscles, no new tendons, no new control, no nerves running into the brain so that it can be, controlled the way that any tailed animal behaves. So the fact that it's on the lower backside and we can sort of picture it analogous to a tail doesn't mean it actually is a tail. That it's called that because it has a loose affiliation. But, the face of the man in the moon isn't really a face. It looks like that to some people. So it doesn't have any bearing on evolution because, again, look at my definition. If we can see the malfunction of the dermal layer, is that the same thing as gaining new genes that didn't previously exist? Well, no. It's just something malfunctioned somewhere. It's like you get skin tags. You know, things go wrong. I'm nearsighted. I need to wear glasses. That's not an evolutionary stage because it's not the result of new genetic information that the parent population didn't have. It's that my eyes are slightly malformed and I need to correct that with lenses. So there's a handful of things people point out, and they'll be like, well, you know, doesn't this show that this family or this individual is different than normal? Doesn't that show evolution? And that's why we have to go back to what evolution is, and the kind of thing that it has to be is that a loss of some kind of genetic function is not the gaining of a new gene. The misapplication of existing genes or the shuffling of new genes or a disease state, I mean, whatever you want to label it as, if it's not the increase in genetic information that causes new structures, functions, and behaviors, it's not an evolutionary step. So I get why, again, as an evolutionist, if you look through evolutionary lenses, you go, whoa, they developed a tail. I will assume that means that there's an evolutionary stage going on. But if you look at the genes of that individual, they're no less human. They don't have any more genes than anyone else. It just becomes like a skin tag. You grew something that gets snipped off, and then you're done with it. You're not a rodent.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's part of the reason why I was kind of skeptical to throw that one into the evolution evidence line, just because, well, as you pointed out, it's questionable at best. And
they're all going to be like that. I've studied a lot, and for the most part, anytime the genes are actually looked at, any of those kind of weird changes come to be that some kind of gene has malfunctioned. Ultimately, it's a disease state. That, you know, it's like being nearsighted, it's like having diabetes. It's not an evolutionary step because it's not an increase in genetic information that leads to new structures, functions, and behaviors. It's the malfunctioning of a gene causing something that was a control feature to lack control. It's like cancer. You know, cancer produces fast-growing cells that are hard to kill. And you think, wow, that's like a superpower, fast-growing and hard to kill. Well, no, because it's not supposed to. There's supposed to be regulation to control the growth, but the control has been broken somehow. It's like if your toilet overflows. You don't go, whoa, it's better now because look at all the water it's producing. You go, no, whatever's supposed to keep the water at a certain level has malfunctioned, and now it's on the floor. That's not a step toward a better machine. That's something's broken and needs to be fixed. So, I mean, again, important to distinguish between change and disease.
Okay. No, that makes sense. The second thing I had to bring up, I don't know if this was real or not. So if it's fake, I give you all permission to make fun of me for it. But
it's fake news.
No, I saw an article the other day where there is a lizard that had a mutation where it grown full wings.
Wow,
they weren't functioning wings, but they did have actual wings. Now, again, this could be fake. You know how easy it is to Photoshop just a weird thing on an animal.
I do that all the time. I know Photoshop. Here's the thing that I would say. If you actually find something like a lizard that has grown wings, number one, it would be hard to use that as evidence for evolution because evolution is supposed to be a slow, gradual process over thousands of or millions of years. So to say that in one generation this thing just popped out wings and go, there, evolution at work, I would be skeptical. But also the way to test this would just say, look at the genes of the previous generations. Do they have whatever genes are the cause of this new physical structure? That there's a lot of times where you're going to find that not all genes are expressed. There are eyeless fish that live in caves. And it's believed that those fish who don't have eyes do have the genes to make eyes, but because they've been in caves for many generations, having eyes is not a benefit. It's actually a detriment. That if you produce eyes in a completely dark environment, it's just something that's damageable that you can, bump into something, get an injury, get an infection. It shortens your lifespan. And so epigenetic changes are when genes are switched on and off due to the environment. That animals and plants have the ability to sort of alter their own genes in terms of turning on and off different features. They go into settings and turn things on and off depending on their environment. And we've learned that what happens to your ancestors 4 generations ago can affect the way that your body behaves now, because in certain situations, it can cause certain, gene switches to be turned on and off, affecting the way that, say, your metabolism might work 3 generations later. So showing that a lizard has wings now might just be that the lizard is now in an environment where that gene switch got flipped back on, and something that it didn't produce for several generations for whatever reason it's now producing. The genes for it were always there, but not all the genes you have are expressed. Most of the genes you have don't get expressed at all. That's why you have distinct tissues. That if all of your genes were expressed all the time, you wouldn't have bone tissue and muscle tissue. You would just be a blob of cancer, which is really disturbing to think about. But there has to be complete control over what's being expressed, how and when. And so sometimes things like that happen where you get a new feature that you didn't see before, or sometimes it's because of combining genes. Again, in the parent population, you have different genes being expressed in different ways, but when those genes are in the same individual, they get expressed in a way that's not merely a combination of one and the other. Like if you have a white flower and you breed it with a red flower, you'd sort of expect the result to be a pink flower. Well, sometimes it's most of them are white and some of them are red, or vice versa. Sometimes it's pink, sometimes it's purple. Like this new color shows up and people go, oh, it's evolution. Well, no, it's just that when those two genes are together, the way they're expressed is differently than just the phenotype that's normally there being expressed at the same time. So you got to look into the genes and see what is it that's causing that change. So in short, more information is needed before you can point to that and say, well, that's evolution, because most likely it's not.
Okay, and that's even assuming that it itself is a real thing and not just something placed back together in Photoshop. Right.
Was it breathing fire and following the command of an evil queen?
I wish. It actually did surprisingly look a lot like Useless.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, then I hope it's real, because that sounds dope.
You know, right? It's the start. It's our new
wish.